Good evening, everyone, or good morning if you're following from the United States. My name is Dimitrios Ayanolopoulos. I'm a professor of law and the head of the Department of Law at Goldsmiths at the University of London. Our department is passionate about engaging with important current debates, providing critical review at the legal and political juncture, and offering a platform for a cross-cultural exchange of ideas, leading to cosmopolitan synergies that can help us tackle the emerging populist threats that liberal democracy and the rule of law are increasingly facing across the world. While witnessing with fear and trepidation and genuine disbelief the dramatic events unfold on January 6th, with the US Capitol being stormed by Donald Trump fanatics, we, everyone here tonight, I have no doubt, were naturally led to reflect on the unprecedented risks that our liberal democracies are confronted with, and to ask how we can best tackle them, what needs to change. The scope of analysis tonight will range from the short term, what happens now in the United States with impeachment and potential criminal liability for Trump and his supporters, to the middle and long term, about how President Biden might aspire to change the political culture, heal the divisions that led to the horrifying events of January 6th. Analysis will also engage the historical and comparative method. There are important lessons to learn, both in the United States, through the prism of US legal and political history, and Europe, where populism has reared its ugly head, with Brexit in the UK and attacks on the rule of law in EU member states. This rapid response event brings together exceptional scholars from across the US and the UK, criminal law and constitutional law experts, as well as legal practitioners and political commentators. We have with us tonight Professor Sionaidh Douglas-Scott of Queen Mary University School of Law, who is currently a Law and Public Affairs Fellow at Princeton University during the academic year 2020-2021. Dr. Alice Lilly, a senior researcher at the Institute for Government. Professor David Alan Sklansky of Stanford Law School. Leslie Thomas QC of Garden Court Chambers, Gresham Professor of Law and Visiting Professor of Law at Goldsmiths University of London. And Professor Stephen Vladeck of the University of Texas School of Law. Each panelist will take around 10 minutes to present their thoughts before we engage with questions from the audience in the end. Please feel free to submit such questions on the Q&A functionality. We will be starting with Professor Stephen Vladeck. Stephen holds the Charles Allen Wright Chair in Federal Courts at the University of Texas School of Law and is a nationally recognized expert on the federal courts, constitutional law, national security law, and military justice. Professor Vladeck has argued multiple cases before the US Supreme Court, the Texas Supreme Court, and lower federal civilian and military courts. He has served as an expert witness both in US state and federal courts and foreign tribunals, and has been repeatedly recognized for his influential and widely cited legal scholarship, his prolific popular writing, his teaching, and his service to the legal profession. Professor Vladeck is the co-host, together with Professor Bobby Chesney, of the popular and award-winning National Security Law podcast. He is CNN's Supreme Court analyst and a co-author of Aspen Publishers' leading national security law and counterterrorism law casebooks. Stephen will discuss issues relating to impeachment and Trump's pardon powers. Stephen, the floor is yours. We're very much looking forward to your contribution tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dimitrios, and thank you all so much for having me. I should apologize off the top that I am not Dahlia Lithwick, and that's probably a net loss for all of us. But let me see if I can try to be a good backup player. So I thought I'd start with just sort of some basics for the folks who don't live and breathe the U.S. law and politics side of this. So we're now less than 23 hours away from the inauguration of Joe Biden as the 46th president. Nothing can happen in the next 23 hours to stop that. The Constitution of the United States sets noon on January 20th as the moment when President Trump's term ends, when the new president's term begins. And so that's going to happen one way or the other tomorrow. The other relevant thing that's going to happen tomorrow, although perhaps less visibly, is that there will be the swearing in of 3 new US senators. Senators Ossoff and Warnock, who were certified just a couple hours ago as the victors in the runoff Senate elections in the state of Georgia, and Senator Alex Padilla, who was appointed by California Governor Newsom to fill the seat that soon-to-be Vice President Harris vacated when she resigned over the weekend. And what that means is that shortly after the inauguration, we will have a right down the middle 50-50 split in the United States Senate, which means that at least nominally, the Democrats will be in charge because under the US Constitution, the vice president is the tiebreaker. And the vice president as of noon tomorrow will be Kamala Harris. So, that's a sort of an important place to start because this becomes Democratic control pretty quickly in ways that have both direct and indirect consequences. So what happens next? So President Trump has been impeached. The impeachment has happened. It's over. The House did it. The next move is for the Senate to begin its formal proceedings. And that's expected to happen as early as this afternoon, although the rules provide that the beginning of the formal proceedings actually takes a full day. So the sort of acknowledgement that the proceedings have begun means that we would start tomorrow afternoon, presumably not long after the swearings in of the 3 new senators. And one of the big questions surrounding the trial is the argument we're increasingly hearing from at least some Republicans in the Senate and from some of the president's supporters that it's actually not constitutional for the Senate to hold a trial of someone who's no longer the president. There is, I think, an overwhelming consensus among US constitutional law scholars, I being one of them, that that's not true. There is historical precedent for trying former officers even after they're no longer in office. Most famously, the trial of the disgraced Secretary of War William Belknap in 1876, who actually tried to avoid impeachment and conviction by resigning the morning of the proceedings. And both the House and the Senate said, nope, we can still proceed. The very first impeachment trial in American history was of a former senator. So I think the important thing to understand is that this argument is meant much the way that the Scottish writer Andrew Lang said drunks use lampposts, for support, not for illumination. The idea is not that they're trying to have a serious constitutional debate. The idea is that it is a procedural fig leaf. It's a procedural hook that might allow some Republicans to vote to acquit President Trump in the trial that's about to happen without having to take a position on the validity of his conduct or the propriety of his conduct. And alas, there's nothing we can really do about that. It's up to the senators to decide. It's a 2/3 vote of those senators who are present that's required to convict, which if everyone shows up means we would need 67 senators, meaning at least 17 Republican senators would have to go along with all 50 Democrats. And at least where we stand right now, Dimitrios, I think it's hard to count to 17. 10, 12, 13 maybe. But I think something else would have to happen between now and when the trial takes place to be convinced that there are 17, whether that's pardons that Trump may yet issue between now and noon Eastern time tomorrow, whether there's further evidence that comes out that links the Trump campaign even more closely to what happened on January 6th. There's reporting out this morning, for instance, that some of the permits were signed by the Trump campaign staff and that this was actually a coordinated event. I think there's room for that to develop. But at least where we stand right now, I think the odds are probably against a conviction. If that changes, if the Senate does ultimately vote to convict, then there's a second vote that the Senate takes about whether Trump should be disqualified from holding office in the future. And at least under the Senate's rules, that is a straight majority vote. It's not hard from where I sit to imagine that if there's 67 senators to convict Trump of the offense of which he was impeached, of incitement to insurrection, there would be at least 51 to vote to disqualify him in light of that conviction, which would presumably take him off the table as a candidate for president in 2024, which ironically might help Republicans, depending upon where you sit. So at least with regard to impeachment, I think that's how this plays out. We'll have a trial in the Senate. There might be a threshold vote on whether they can even proceed, but that will probably pass by a majority. And then it'll come down to just whether there are 17 senators on the Republican side who are willing to convict. The other piece of this is also the question of whether anything is going to happen to members of Congress who were involved in the events leading up to January 6th. There's at least some suggestion that a couple of members, including Congresswoman Boebert from Colorado, might have actually been helping some of the insurrectionists plan their attack. I don't think there's any evidence of that yet, but of course, Congress has the power to expel its members. Each chamber by a 2/3 vote can expel a member. There's also the mostly dormant provision of the US Constitution's 14th Amendment that provides that those who engage in insurrection against the United States are not qualified to hold office under the United States. So it's possible we will see that deployed before we're done. But at least where we stand right now, I don't see a real groundswell in that direction. I think we would have to have more information, more evidence come out. And then, of course, Dimitrios, there's the question of the pardons. The president has promised upwards of 100 pardons today. We don't know who that's going to be. We don't know for which offenses. So let me just sort of do like really quickly what is and what is not settled about the pardon power. Under the US Constitution, the president has remarkably broad power to issue pardons for any federal offenses. The only exception is, quote, in cases of impeachment, unquote. There's some debate about what that means. I'm one of those who thinks it just means you can't use a pardon to defeat the impeachment process. That's probably the narrowest view. There are some who think it actually means you can't issue a pardon while you're impeached, which would mean he couldn't issue a pardon right now. I don't think that will hold up. But the question is, right, will he pardon, for example, those who have been charged with offenses arising out of the January 6th attack? I think that's a distinct possibility. Is he going to pardon his family members, Donald Trump Jr., his sons, for whatever shenanigans they may have gotten up to? I think that's a possibility. And then, of course, there's the big question: is he going to pardon himself? I think the overwhelming consensus is that self-pardons are not constitutional, but of course, we've never had one. And so the only way that could actually be sorted out is if he did it, which I think would actually ironically provoke the Biden administration into prosecuting him, because it would not be in the government's interest to leave that precedent out there. So, I think what happens after tomorrow depends at least to some degree on what happens in the next 22 hours and 45 minutes, and whether Trump really does continue to provide fodder, not just to Democrats, but to those of his party in the Senate who are more moderate to keep going. And then, Dimitrios, I want to sort of raise the long-term question, but leave it to my smarter colleagues on the panel to answer. Which is, where do we go from here as a country? I have no idea. I think there is a real schism forming in the Republican Party between those members of the party who we might think of as the sort of more establishment conservatives, the sort of the George W. Bush model, who have been quite vocal, at least in the last month, in their criticisms of the president for continuing to lie about the election, for continuing to misrepresent the results of the election. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been very critical, at least in the last week, of the president in this respect. And I think there are at least some senators and some members of the House who are going to be on that side of the coin. But then there are the 140 members of the House Republican Conference who voted to object to presidential electors for Joe Biden. That's that's about 2/3 of the House Republican Conference. There are however many senators who are going to vote to acquit President Trump. And so I think, the real question, Dimitrios, is in the 2022 midterm elections, are the folks who have actually shown some principle in the last couple of months all going to be primaried from the right and lose primary elections for standing on principle? Or is there going to be a resurgence of some kind of centrist responsibility in the Republican Party now that they're out of office in both chambers of Congress and the presidency? And the best I can do there, Dimitrios, is to say I think time will tell. And so why don't I stop there and allow my colleagues to explain everything I got wrong.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm sure that will not be the case. I'm sure our fellow panelists or your fellow panelists here will be very keen to continue on the line of thinking that you have already developed. Thank you very much for setting the scene for us. That's very much appreciated, particularly for the attention of our international audiences too. Those in Britain and others in Europe that I know have connected with the event, who may not necessarily be fully familiar with the ins and outs of these part of constitutional law as far as pardons are concerned, and impeachment more specifically, which is quite idiosyncratic, I might point out, element of US constitutional law. I understand you have to go at 7 o'clock UK time, but I hope we will have time before that to continue the conversation, potentially to answer questions too that might come from our audience. But once again, thank you very much for your initial input, Steve. Our next speaker will be Professor David Sklansky. So David teaches and writes about criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence. He serves as faculty co-director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center and is a faculty affiliate of Stanford Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and a member of the American Law Institute. In 2017, he received the law school's John Bingham Halbert Award for excellence in teaching. Before joining Stanford, Professor Sklansky taught at Berkeley and UCLA. He won campus-wide teaching awards at both institutions. Earlier, he practiced labor law in Washington, D.C., and served as an assistant United States attorney in Los Angeles. We had the immense pleasure of having Professor Sklansky deliver our annual criminal justice lecture in 2019, and are greatly looking forward to seeing his monograph on a pattern of violence, how the law classifies crimes and what it means for justice, that he's drawn upon in our annual lecture, come out this March, I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong, David. David will be discussing potential criminal liability for Trump, which we understand is unlikely, but will be very interesting to hear his thoughts on this. And he will also be reflecting on how prosecutions on Trump's supporters that stormed Capitol are developing so far. He may also have time to reflect on what we can learn from the judiciary's approach to Trump in the past 4 years, about how far they might now go with some of the issues that we are discussing today, including criminal liability. David, great to have you here again. Thank you very much for your input. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dimitrios. It's nice to be back at Goldsmiths, if only virtually. And I appreciate Goldsmiths organizing this important panel. I'm going to take the questions that you raised in reverse order, Dimitrios, and start with how courts have done during the Trump era. They've done pretty well in maintaining their independence. I think that was most apparent in the 2 months following last November's election, when Trump and his supporters filed some 60 lawsuits in state and federal courts challenging the results of the election and lost across the board. And that wasn't really unexpected. Throughout Trump's presidency, courts pushed back, blocking, stalling, moderating some of the worst initiatives of the administration. And that's despite Trump having appointed a record number of federal judges, including 3 justices of the Supreme Court. He got a conservative bench, but he didn't get a lawless bench. And maybe that's an easy test to pass. It's hard to know what would have happened if Trump had had a second term. But I think these days we need to take any good news we can get. So what kinds of criminal prosecutions can we expect growing out of the assault on the Capitol on January 6th? So barring pardons, which I agree with Steve are a wild card, lots of people are going to be convicted for participating in the riot and the invasion of the Capitol. There have been 70 arrests already. I'll be surprised if that number doesn't exceed 100 in coming weeks, again, bracketing the possibility of pardons. And the reason why there's so many arrests and the reason why they're going to lead to conviction, there are 2 reasons. One is that there's tons of documentation of what happened, because many of the rioters were filming themselves and posting it to the internet, which is something I want to get back to, and because the criminal violations here are clear-cut. This isn't an area where we need to add, where there's some uncertainty about whether crimes were committed. Trespassing on Capitol grounds is a misdemeanor. Trespassing on Capitol grounds when the vice president is there is punishable by up to a year in prison. If you bring a gun with you when you do that, that's punishable by up to 10 years in prison under federal law. Violently entering the floor of Congress, which many people film themselves doing is punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Stealing government property is a crime punishable by up to a year or by up to 10 years if the property is worth more than $1,000. Assaulting a federal officer is punishable by up to 8 years in prison or 20 years if an injury results. There are separate statutes that criminalize threats to kill, kidnap, or harm the vice president, bringing explosives across state lines to damage federal property, attempting to destroy federal property with explosives, and of course, anybody who is convicted for the murder or manslaughter of a federal officer will receive a much longer sentence. And if anyone, including members of Congress, can be proven to have intentionally aided or abetted any of those offenses, that's punishable by the same terms that are applicable to the direct perpetrators. So the only person who almost certainly is not going to be criminally prosecuted for the riot is Donald Trump, the person who is most responsible for it. And the reason for that is that under American constitutional law, speeches advocating or seeming to threaten violence are criminally prosecutable only if they're calculated to cause imminent violence, which means that they have to be intended to cause imminent violence and they have to be likely to cause imminent violence. And you might think that Trump's remarks on January 6th and the preceding weeks satisfy that test, and they might. But the courts have overwhelmingly interpreted the First Amendment test to require explicit calls for violence, which Trump didn't make. And that might seem like a silly and wooden approach to take in assessing whether speech is criminally prosecutable. And if you think that way, you're not alone. There have been many people over the years who have said that the United States should be more flexible in thinking about the responsibility of people who incite violence. I'll give you one example because it's kind of close to home. In the 1940s, there was a guy named Arthur Terminiello in the United States who was a kind of low-rent proto-Trump. He traveled around the country railing against Jews and communists and New Dealers. And in Chicago in 1946, he gave a speech to about 1,500 of his supporters, most of which was an attack on Jews, communists, and the left-wing protesters who had gathered outside the hall, who he called snakes, bedbugs, cavemen. He told his supporters not to be tolerant of the mob, but he didn't explicitly call for violence. In fact, he told his supporters to walk out of here dignified. He said, there'll be violence, but men, don't you do it. So he's convicted of breach of the peace. He was fined $100 and the Supreme Court reversed because he hadn't said anything that explicitly called for violence. And the jury instructions had allowed the jury to convict him if they determined that his speech in context was likely to get people angry enough to be violent. So one of the justices who dissented in that case was Robert Jackson, who said, we need to look at speeches like this in context because Terminiello was following what Jackson said was the classic tactic of European fascists, whipping up violence while never explicitly stepping over the line and calling for it. And Jackson said democracies needed to be able to protect themselves against this kind of speech. Freedom of speech depended on the ability of democracies to do so. Otherwise, he said, the Bill of Rights would become a suicide pact. And Jackson knew what he was talking about when he talked about European fascism. He had recently returned from serving as the chief US prosecutor at Nuremberg. But in the late 1940s, when the Supreme Court heard this case, it seemed to lots of Americans that our politics were immune not only to European fascism, but even to proto-fascist forms of populism. And the Supreme Court said, we don't have anything to fear from this kind of speech. We don't have anything to fear from unrestrained speech. Good speech cures bad speech. So today, it's much harder to be confident that the United States is immune from proto-fascist brands of populism. 15% of American adults told pollsters last week that they approved of the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. And majority of Republicans tell pollsters that they believe that Joe Biden didn't actually win last November's election. And that is a consequence, in part, of the way that the internet has transformed discourse, not only in the United States, but around the world. It's allowed a kind of hyperconnectivity and also a kind of siloing. So nobody was surprised that the participants in the assault on the Capitol on January 6th were largely recruited and radicalized on the internet. And nobody was surprised that the raid was performed in large part for the internet, that many of the people who were participating in it were streaming themselves or uploading videos of what they did to the internet. Everybody had their cell phones out. And that's true of lots of radical right-wing violence today, including some of the most atrocious mass shootings in recent years. It was true infamously of the Christchurch massacres in 2019 and of the synagogue shooting in San Diego here in California a month later. I think that one of the challenges that we have in the United States, and I think it's a challenge for liberal democracies around the world, is figuring out how to deal with the changing relationship between speech and violence, and speech and political violence in the coming years. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think the United States in general knows the answer. And I'm not sure any democracies around the world have the answer to this yet, but I do think that it's one of the largest challenges that we face going forward from January 6th.
Thank you so much, David, for breaking down for us with such clarity the context for the application of criminal legislation in relation to the events that we witnessed on January 6th. But equally importantly, the constitutional law ramifications that these events and the whole era of Trump that is now coming to an end, the ramifications that these might have for potential reforms, or an opportunity to revisit these more convoluted or out of sync, I would say, with modern phenomena aspects of US constitutional law. And of course, that is not just idiosyncratic to the US. As you rightly pointed out, liberal democracies across the world are facing similar dilemmas and similar challenges about the extent of the freedom of speech, for instance, and the need to protect citizens from violence that might ensue as a result of its expression. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation later on during Q&A. But now we can move to our third panelist. So with equal pleasure, I'm looking forward to introducing and listening from Professor Leslie Thomas, QC. Professor Leslie Thomas of Garden Court Chambers is the preeminent authority in the UK in claims against the police, particularly relating to deaths in custody, as well as claims against other public authorities and corporations. Leslie's high-profile work includes the inquest that followed the Birmingham pub bombing, the Hillsborough football disaster, and Mark Duggan, and he's currently representing 23 clients, including survivors, bereaved families, and loved ones in the inquiry that investigates the catastrophic events that led to the death of 72 people in the Grenfell Tower inquiry, one of the UK's worst modern disasters. Leslie was awarded Legal Aid Barrister of the Year in 2012 and again in 2016 for his work on the Hillsborough disaster. His appointment as a visiting professor of law in our Department of Law at Goldsmiths in September 2020 coincided with his appointment as the first Black professor of law at Gresham College. His inaugural lecture series at Gresham is examining death, the state, and human rights. Leslie makes invaluable contributions, I can't stress it enough, to our law program, and we're very privileged for all the exciting synergies that we have already forged. Leslie will attempt to draw the contrast between the inadequate policing in Capitol Hill and the violent policing of the BLM protests. Leslie, very much looking forward to hearing from you as ever. It's very exciting to have you with us.
Thank you for such a warm welcome, and thank you for the invitation with such a distinguished panel from my colleagues across the pond, as they say, in relation to the activities that have been happening in Washington and in the States generally since the election. I asked myself.
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you briefly, Leslie. If you could perhaps speak closer to your microphone, or it was breaking up a little bit, but perhaps I think when you were about to start, it sounded better.
I start by asking myself this question: is there fairness and equity in the treatment of different peoples, and in particular how white people are treated in comparison to people of colour? Here's a quote. Guess who? It left me with so many questions about the future, questions about security, extremism, propaganda, and more. What if the writers looked like people who attended the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the historic black church in Atlanta, where the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once served as a co-pastor, now led by Senator Raphael Warnock. And the person who I'm quoting said, "I think we know the answer." That was former First Lady Michelle Obama. But don't simply take it from the former First Lady. Here's another quote. No one can tell me that if it had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesters yesterday, that they wouldn't have been treated very differently from the mob that stormed the Capitol. We all know that's true, and it's unacceptable. President-elect Joe Biden on the 7th of January of this year. It was obvious to all. But what was obvious? You see, ever since the 60s and the civil rights protest movement and the Black Power movement, you know, there's been a real sense that protests from the left, and in particular protests that try to push the rights of minorities, which somehow represents an existential threat to the states. Let's compare and contrast, shall we? Let's look at what happened 2 Wednesdays ago with the Trump mob. The police needed hours to drive them out. But the damage they did was substantial. 4 people died, including a police officer. Police officers were beaten up. And it didn't stop there. More than 60 people were arrested. At least 50 police officers were injured. Officers confiscated guns, pipe bombs, and Molotov cocktails. And here's the thing. Surprisingly few police stood in the way, despite the fact that that protest had been expected for days. The police appeared unprepared for an actual insurrection and not even prepared to keep the doors of the Capitol locked. You know, we've seen video of officers calmly talking with the attackers after they moved into the building. There's footage of an officer taking a selfie with the mob. And you literally have thousands of people rushing into the People's House, walking through the Capitol. In some instances, pasting and placing pipe bombs and other things around the Capitol. Now, compare and contrast that with the demonstrations last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd and the deaths of other Black men and women. When the demonstrators took to the streets near the White House to protest the killing of George Floyd and other police abuses, President Trump called for a strong show of force, including active military personnel deployed on the streets of the nation's capital. In fact, Pentagon officials eventually had to talk Trump out of that demand. So federal security forces were called in, including guards from the US Bureau of Prisons who did not wear identifying name tags. The response was widely seen as heavy-handed. It included security forces driving out peaceful, yes, peaceful protesters to clear the way for that infamous photo op with that President Trump wanted at the church near the White House. You see, this came after a year of protests and confrontations with police, after police shootings and other kinds of killings across the country. Many of those protests were put down harshly, including those that took place in Washington, D.C. Officials reacted with tear gas, tasers, stun grenades. You know, we saw rubber bullets. We saw, water hoses. Professor Eddie Glaude at Princeton University Department of African Studies said this, quote, "What we see here is that certain bodies are rewarded with a certain kind of treatment and other bodies are not." You see, it appears, certainly to me as an outsider, that America is more comfortable with protests from the right than it is from protests from the left. Demonstrations from the left are often seen to represent some sort of threat to the country, whereas right-wing protesters are seen as some sort of patriotic gesture. Well, the question has to be asked, how do you justify the difference in treatment? Can the difference in treatment be justified? And I repeat, and I come back to the question of policing. And you see, this is not just a question that affects our cousins across the pond. It's a question that we have to ask in the UK as well. Is there fairness and equity in the treatment of different peoples when it comes to the way they're policed? And to my mind, having set out the case, the answer would appear to be a definite and a resounding no.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I mean, important food for thought there. Of course, these are questions that we have been struggling with ourselves in the UK. It was only a few months ago. It was in June 2020 when we were here, and you were part of a similar panel, and we had colleagues again from across the Atlantic, from Berkeley on that occasion, and we again were discussing the similarities and differences between policing and the link between policing and racial inequality, racial injustice. But I think you have painted that contrast again between the policing of the BLM movement on the one hand, the Trump supporters, fanatics, as I said earlier on the other, as vividly and emphatically as one could. And we're very thankful to you for doing that. I suppose interesting questions will also emerge from that, also derive from that, in relation to the criminal liability of the police officers, of the police institution itself that has led something like this to happen. And they will need to be held to account for adopting such variables, such different standards. We have discussed criminal liability, but perhaps we didn't have the chance to extend our analysis to that. Perhaps there will be an opportunity later on. Thanks again. Thank you very much, Leslie. And again, looking forward to further input in tonight's panel. Our next fourth panelist tonight is Professor Sionaidh Douglas-Scott. Professor Douglas-Scott is the anniversary chair in law at Queen Mary University at the University of London, and currently a law and public affairs fellow at Princeton University. Before joining Queen Mary, Professor Douglas-Scott was Professor of European and Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford, and before that, Professor of Law at King's College London. She retains a link with Oxford as Honorary Research Fellow at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford. Professor Douglas-Scott's scholarship, including her monograph, Constitutional Law of the European Union, the co-edited research handbook on EU law and human rights, and her monograph, Law After Modernity, has been widely recognized in the field of constitutional law. She is a member of the advisory boards of the Constitution Society and International Society of Constitutional Law, British-Irish chapter. Sionaidh writes on matters of the Constitution for the national media and is a frequent contributor to Prospect magazine. Sionaidh was awarded a major Leverhulme Research Fellowship from 2018 to 2021 to work on a project on Brexit and British constitutional unsettlement. This project investigates the impact of Brexit on a constitution already unsettled and under strain. We have previously had the great privilege of being joined by Sionaidh for one of our events in the context of the work that our Britain Europe think tank has undertaken in connection with the rights of EU citizens in the UK after Brexit, and are delighted to welcome her back to Goldsmiths. Sionaidh will be drawing on the lessons that we can learn from US legal history about division and attempted succession, and on the populist parallels with Brexit and threats to the rule of law and liberal democracy in parts of the EU. Sionaidh, thank you so much for joining us, and very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on all or some of the above.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitrios. Thank you for that over-generous introduction. Yes, I've been living in the US since 2018 for personal and for academic reasons. So I'm going to talk a bit about just some perhaps rather personal reflections on what's happened, and then switch to the UK and Brexit and the EU. And I suspect I'll run out of time then, so I won't have any more general abstract reflections, but we'll see, we'll see. My first thought is about the issue of accountability for the insurrection at the Capitol. There's been an awful lot of talk about healing and unity recently, including from Joe Biden. But I really wonder how much room there is for that, because after all, before you can have healing and unity, you've got to have some sort of justice, which is, I think, why all of these measures are so important, whether it's impeachment or the criminal process. There can't be any moving on if you don't have that. You can't just wash your hands and say, well, let's forget about the past and move forward. And in the presidential campaign, the Republicans emphasized they were the party of law and order. Well, law and order requires some sort of accountability, and accountability for a president who has incited some sort of riot is impeachment. And if there can't be accountability for what he did last January the 6th, well, I don't know when you can ever impeach a president. So I'd say that you need both sides to be committed to the democratic process for there to be unity and healing. And I think that's going to be a problem, because we have this thing that's been recently described as the big lie, namely that Trump won the election. He said it again and again and again. We won it by a landslide. And an awful lot of Republicans believe that. And it seems that there's a very big section of Republicans who believe, well, democracy is fine if we win, but it's not okay if we don't win. So basically, you've got a situation where an awful lot of American voters don't believe in democracy. And I don't really know what you can do with that. And that's definitely been supported by this big lie. And it's a big lie that Trump won the election, the sort of lie that's been described as something that changes the fabric of reality. Third reflection on what's going on in the US is looking back at the past. My research has meant that I've been looking at an awful lot of legal history, some of it British, some of it American. I've been reading a lot about American legal history, union, disunion, the Civil War. And I've noticed that probably appositely in this case, there's been comparison between what's been going on recently and what went on 150 years ago or so. How do you provide the sort of healing that's necessary when you have such a divided public? These were questions that were asked after the Civil War. And some people have said, well, you shouldn't use dormant provisions like the 14th Amendment. I think Steve Vladeck mentioned that earlier on, 14th Amendment Section 3, as a remedy for those who engage in insurrection against the US. They can be disqualified from office if they're politicians. And some people have said, well, let's not bother. That hasn't been used for a long while. But it seems to me that there's this really unpleasant undertone of what went on last week in the Capitol. People were carrying Confederate flags. They had clothing with unpleasant, racist messages. And we can look back 140, 50 years to compromises that were made. At the end of Reconstruction, there was no real reconciliation. So I think here the past is not really past. And although the division may be of a different sort today to the geographical division there was in the US at the time of the Civil War between North and South, today it seems to be more widespread throughout the country. Perhaps it's a bit urban versus rural, perhaps it's other things. But I think that the past is not past, and that's a problem. And that's a problem on the other side of the Atlantic too, in Europe. And I'm going to switch now to talk about picking up on some links with what's been going on in Britain in particular, and Brexit. And okay, in Britain, we haven't seen Westminster, the Houses of Parliament, being stormed. But for an awful long time, we got used to seeing British MPs being abused, being jostled on their way into Parliament, mainly by Brexit supporters, but by others as well. We've seen one MP assassinated by a far-right British nationalist. Britain has its own very, very strong culture war, I think, and is as divided as is the US. And we've had a series of very high-profile constitutional events comparable to some of the things that have gone on in the US. And I think a lot of the actions in the Brexit debates were part of that. And one could roughly sum that up as saying, well, is this leading to some sort of illiberal democracy or illiberal constitutionalism? And by that, I mean a sort of constitutional capture, where key constitutional principles like human rights, the rule of law, judicial review, separation of powers, they're applied selectively, arbitrarily, sometimes not at all. And that's a constitutional manipulation that's sometimes justified as necessary to implement or satisfy, I quote, the will of the people, and to ensure strong, efficient, stable government. So you end up with an almost contradictory sense in which under a liberal constitutional or illiberal democracy, states may at least formally be democracies and not dictatorship, and have some sort of functioning constitution, but something is clearly going very wrong. And I'm just going to end by picking up on a couple of events in the Brexit referendum that I think have all sorts of echoes and salience in what has been going on in the US and the sort of lies and falsehoods one has seen. With the EU referendum campaign, where both Leave sides broke the law. They were fined for it. They were fined by the Electoral Commission for overspending, and they were overspending on 1.5 billion ads that went out to people to misinform them. And there's an awful lot of that misinformation going out through the social media, influencing people. Two very prominent campaigns in Brexit. One was the Brexit battle bus. Do you remember that bus? It was a major icon of the EU referendum with the slogan, "We send the EU 350 million in a week. Let's fund our NHS instead, vote Leave." Except none of that slogan was true. Britain didn't send that amount because of the rebate. Sent a much lower amount of 276 million. And even if you take that into account, most of the money came back in forms of rebates and grants to various institutions, regions of Britain. That was pointed out, but the bus went on and its slogan unchanged, and the damage was done. People believed that. They believed that over the complicated sort of complex finances of the EU budget, which are impossible for anybody really to take on board. So that was one example. The other example was the poster breaking point that Nigel Farage put up, I don't know, a couple of weeks before the referendum, and it looked as if the Remain campaign was drawing ahead. And this showed a large queue of migrants extending well into the distance with the caption, "We must break free of the EU and take back control of our borders," giving the impression to people frightened of immigration that this was a large queue of EU migrants desperate to get into the UK, except it wasn't at all. These were Syrian refugees for the most part, trying to cross over to Slovenia, not into the UK. But again, the damage had been done. And people were not believed that this was going to be some sort of, I don't know, caravan of migrants, to use Trump's words. And shortly afterwards, soon after the poster was unveiled, Joe Cox, an MP, was tragically murdered by a right-wing extremist shouting "Britain first." So these are examples of the damage that falsehoods and very large lies can do, which have absolutely earth-shattering consequences, which change life for everybody. But the illegalities in the campaign didn't nullify the result or set aside triggering Article 50, even if compounded by use of these false slogans. So I think there is some comparison in what's going on, and in both jurisdictions, you see some sort of business as normal. The constitution continues. There is a government that's lawfully elected. But people are sitting, with bated breath, wondering what is going to happen next. And it's a very uncomfortable time. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sionaidh, for this fascinating historical exposition at the beginning, and then for drawing with such detail but succinctly to the important similarities and contrasts in relation to the debates that we have also been having in the UK for a few years now. And I'm sure that is a theme that we will return to in the remainder of the event. I mean, I think there are not many things that better encapsulate the populist synergies than the personal friendship that Donald Trump developed with our Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Similarly, the important role that Nigel Farage seemed to play in the US election, in Trump's election. The synergies were there. They were intellectual and they were practical, ideological and practical too. I'm conscious of the fact that Steve needs to go in a few minutes from now. So I was wondering, Steve, whether you have some follow-up observations or reactions to what was said. I saw, and I'm very thankful to you for having answered some of the questions already that have come through the Q&A function. So I'd be very keen to hear from you.
No, I mean, I don't want to get in the way of Alice's presentation. I just want to say that, I think it's really important along the lines of what everyone else has been saying, that this is not just a US specific conversation, and that, you know, there are some quirks to our constitutional system that I think make some of these problems harder for us, and I think some of them easier, having a presidential system as opposed to a parliamentary one. But, you know, the question of how we find some degree of common ground in a world in which people are experiencing two completely different information ecosystems, one of which is laden with truth and one of which is not, is hardly unique to the United States. And I, you know, if I had any idea how to solve that, I think I'd be something other than a law professor. But I'm grateful to at least be having the conversation.
And we're grateful to you for your input tonight, Steve. Very much looking forward to staying in contact. Thank you again. And with that, we are moving to our final presentation for tonight by Dr. Alice Lilly. Alice is a senior researcher with the Institute for Government, a non-partisan think tank focused on making government more effective. It's one of the leading UK think tanks. Alice works on the Institute's Whitehall Monitor project, which uses data to assess the performance of the UK government. Since joining the Institute in 2016, she has also led work on the effectiveness of parliamentary scrutiny of government policies and legislation. Alice obtained an MA and PhD from the University of Nottingham, where her thesis focused on the history of anti-poverty policy under Bill Clinton and the links between New Democrats in the US and New Labour in the UK. Alice will reflect on where we find ourselves and what to look out for with impeachment and beyond, and whether Biden, the dollar, $1 million question, on whether Biden can fix America's broken legal and political culture. Alice, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Dimitrios, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to join such an august panel, and I feel like I should really emphasize that I am not a lawyer or legal scholar, so I will defer to my more learned colleagues on those matters. I suppose I'm really approaching this through the lens more of kind of history and politics, and as Dimitrios says, thinking really about where we are now in the kind of immediate future, but also that much bigger question that Steve alluded to earlier, which is where do we go from here? So the first thing I wanted just to talk about briefly is really what to look out for in the next few weeks as the Senate's second impeachment trial of Donald Trump goes on. Steve's already sort of taken us through some of the process. But I think there's a few really tricky things and really interesting things to point out here, because we are in pretty much uncharted territory here. It has never happened that a president has been impeached twice. It has never happened that a former president has faced trial in the Senate, although there are sort of precedents for other officials. So it really is worth stressing that we are in a very strange place at the moment, and there is not really a clear blueprint for what comes next. I think the first thing really to keep an eye out for is the timing of any Senate trial. As was mentioned earlier, it could potentially begin as soon as tomorrow, which would allow Democrats to kind of pick up perhaps on some of the rawness of feelings at the moment and some of the strength of feeling in Congress. But it's also possible that the Democrats might try and seek to delay the trial because they have a new administration. Joe Biden needs to press on with confirmation hearings for his cabinet appointments and for other key nominees. He wants to pass a huge COVID relief package. The vaccine is currently being rolled out across the US. The pandemic is in a really bad state in the US. He has a lot to do. And an impeachment trial in the Senate takes up a lot of time. It also takes up a lot of political capital. It would certainly be unusual, to say the least, for a new president to kind of have their first 100 days, even perhaps their first 10 days, politically overshadowed by the impeachment of their immediate predecessor. So that's a tricky thing for the Democrats to try and balance. It might be that they try and get the Senate to kind of split its business in two so that they spend part of their day on impeachment and they spend part of their day on other business, but it's not really clear how that will play out. And then the second question is, we don't know how long any trial will last for. If history is to be a guide, you would expect it to be a few weeks. At the same time, there is just one article of impeachment that Donald Trump faces. And again, there is this kind of timing issue for the Democrats. There is an incentive for them to get this over with quite quickly. And I suppose all of this also relates to the second set of things to look out for, which is how this sort of trial will actually work and how it will unfold. Some of the first sort of fights and votes that you will see in the trial will be over the very specific rules for how that trial will be run. So one of the big questions, for example, will be, will witnesses be called? That's something that did happen in Bill Clinton's impeachment trial. It hasn't happened in some others. And the key thing here to remember is, of course, that the Democrats will control the Senate by the time that this happens. So they are likely to get their way on whatever procedures it is that the trial will follow. And then we come to the third thing, which of course is the biggest and most obvious immediate question, which is what happens? Is Donald Trump convicted? As was mentioned earlier, this requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate. That's a high, high bar. It's a bar so high that it has never been met before for a president in US history. You're looking at around 17 Republican senators voting to convict, and that is a huge ask. Whether there will be 17 or not probably comes down in large part to Mitch McConnell, the outgoing Senate Majority Leader, and what he decides to do. I see that a little earlier this afternoon, he said on the floor of the Senate that he believed the mob that attacked the Capitol was provoked by the president, and that seems like potentially a significant statement, but we shall see. As I think it was Steve who mentioned earlier, it seems very likely that there will be some Republican senators who will vote to acquit Donald Trump, but they will cite procedural grounds and process grounds rather than sort of making a judgment on whether they think Trump actually is responsible for what happened. And the other thing I think to watch out for really in the intervening weeks is whether you see momentum start to sort of build, particularly among Republicans, for either conviction or acquittal, because each Republican who makes clear that they are going to vote against the president makes it slightly easier for sort of further Republicans to come out and say that. We also don't know how the trial will unfold. We don't know who will be making the case for Donald Trump. There was speculation it would be Rudolph Giuliani. It seems that that won't be the case, which is possibly good news for Donald Trump, but we don't know. We also don't know, as Steve mentioned, what will happen in the coming days and weeks. What will ex-President Trump do? What might he say? What further revelations might come out about what happened on January the 6th? And it's, you know, incredibly unfortunate and disturbing that we have to say this, but what if there is further violence, be that in Washington or in state capitals or elsewhere? But the second thing I wanted to come on and talk about is the much bigger picture in terms of where we are. And this is the question that Steve posed earlier, which is sort of where does the US go from here? And we don't know. It's very hard to know at the moment. But I think the thing to remember is that, you know, what happened on January the 6th is sort of partly about the Trump administration. Yes, that's absolutely true, but it is also about much kind of broader questions. It seems really that American political and democratic culture at the moment is broken. Political violence has a long history in the United States. Conspiracy theories have a long history in the United States. Deep-seated political divisions have a long history in the United States, and we should not forget those things. But at the same time, it feels like there's something different at the moment. It feels like there's some kind of step change at the moment, and not least that incitement to violence and that those conspiracy theories are coming from within the White House, and they are also coming from within at least some sections of Congress, and that's different, as is the fact that social media really allows these theories and these ideas to spread very far and very quickly. And I think the thing really to focus on at the moment is the fact that the US is not just divided on issues. It's not even just divided on values at the moment. It is divided on reality. polling shows, and I think it was David who cited this earlier, that there are large numbers of Americans who believe that there was widespread fraud in the election in November. There are large numbers of Americans who believe that the president who will be sworn in tomorrow is not a legitimate president. We've seen politicians both before and after January the 6th in airports and on the streets being shouted at and being called traitors, being told they are committing acts of treason. We've heard some elected representatives expressing fear about how their votes in Congress might be taken and about their sort of personal safety and the safety of their families. And it is obvious to say that this is not the sign of a political culture that is in any way healthy or is in any way a good place. And that's not merely going to go away when Joe Biden becomes president. It's also not even going to go away even if Donald Trump were to be convicted by the Senate and to be stripped of the right to hold office in the future. That's not to say that those things won't make a difference. Joe Biden will take a very different tone as president. He has a very different character. If we think back to the remarks that he made on January the 6th, I mean, that much was incredibly clear. And the tone and character of the president matter. And that has been made very clear over the last 4 years. But that doesn't change a culture. And neither, I think, would Trump being found guilty and not being able to hold office. It is absolutely important from an accountability point of view, as was mentioned earlier. And, you know, I was reading back through some transcripts back from the Clinton impeachment, and I came across one of the House managers who presented the case against Bill Clinton, talking about impeachment as important because it cleanses the office of the president. That person was, in fact, now Senator Lindsey Graham, and it will be interesting to see if he maintains that view in the coming weeks. But that basic point about cleansing an office, making a statement and saying, we do not believe that a president can do this, and even if they have left office, they must suffer the consequences for what they did. Yes, that does matter. But again, that's not enough to kind of change a culture. And really, I suppose what that comes down to is everybody. It comes down to the president, to people in Congress and in state level government as well. It comes down to the media, to social media companies, to kind of all of civil society to think about what their political culture is and what they want it to be. And where that will end up, I think, is really difficult to say. It is in potentially a very dangerous place at the moment. And I think if I was to end on perhaps a slightly more positive note, I suppose the one thing that perhaps we might be able to take from this is that there has been a real awakening among some people, if not all, but a real awakening to the fact that democracy and a sort of sensible and inclusive political culture is not something that should be taken for granted. It isn't something that just happens. It's something that I suppose is a bit like a muscle. It needs strengthening, it needs continuous work, and it is fragile. And perhaps that's a positive thing that has been realized, but, you know, look how much it has taken for people to get there. And where do we go from here?
Thank you so much, Alice, for such a comprehensive, really enlightening presentation. And I suppose, you know, if we as democratic societies need such blatant demonstrations of incivility and violence to have an awakening, you know, to look into ourselves and start looking for answers, then we must be going in the wrong direction. And I'm saying that having in mind that we were having exactly the same conversations a few months ago when we were then discussing about the awakening of the public conscience in relation to racial injustice and racial inequality. You know, with we were placing similar emphasis on the fact that our society was now becoming more aware, perhaps more engaged, perhaps more prepared to react. But it should certainly not take such levels of violence and acting in an extreme way for us to demonstrate these democratic instincts that we should be flexing and exercising all the time, as you pointed out there in concluding. So thank you very much, everyone, for your very insightful contributions. There are quite a few questions that have now come through the Q&A. Some have already been answered, but I will pick a few, and we can take it from there. So there is a question about the symbolism around the Donald Trump, or the end of Trump, to be more specific. And the question is about whether Trump is the end of the Tea Party. And I don't know if one of our participants might be keen to provide an answer to that. What does the end of Donald Trump mean at that kind of political level? I don't know if anyone might wish to come in on that. I think that Steve has already provided a quick answer, saying that if I can yes, I think Trump is definitely a stage of the Tea Party, he mentioned, but I doubt that he's the final stage. The strongest evidence is the election to the House in this cycle of folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia and Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina. The problem is how partisan gerrymandering makes primary elections more important in many House districts than the general election, thereby favoring extremist candidates. If I can move on to another question. David, you were reflecting on the limitations, the jurisprudence around the First Amendment that makes it very unlikely that Donald Trump might be held to account from a criminal liability viewpoint. Would you say that the events that we have recently witnessed in Capitol, but also this tumultuous period, 4 years of Donald Trump, might make the judiciary in the US think again and perhaps revisit some of these more complex aspects of the First Amendment in the US? And I know we have similar debates in the UK and Europe around the limitations of the freedom of speech.
Well, I think that these events are definitely going to lead some judges, as well as some people off the bench, to rethink how First Amendment law should work. But I am not expecting to see any large shifts in First Amendment law in this regard anytime soon, mainly because I don't think anybody has a good map for where we should go. And because I think that there is a widespread sense that freedom of speech is important. Even Justice Jackson shared that view. The move that he was suggesting was a relatively minor one. He agreed that speech advocating violence should be criminally prosecutable only if it was intended to and likely to lead to imminent violence. He just thought that the court should be less wooden and formalistic and literal in figuring out whether speech satisfied that test. It's possible that the events of January 6th will lead some people to be more sympathetic to his viewpoint, but I think it's early to say.
Sionaidh and Alice, and Sionaidh mentioned that we are confronted with very serious culture wars in the UK, and freedom of speech immediately comes into play. I mean, how we strike the the balance there. We have seen the kind of impact that shutting down Donald Trump has had. So you have had a number of commentators and experts, even those that would definitely not want to see Donald Trump on Twitter for a single additional hour, and yet expressing, being skeptical about whether that measure might be counterproductive. And so I'm wondering whether you feel that we should perhaps not be going that far, even in the face of someone who has clearly misused the relevant technology there, including in relation to the events that we have just witnessed on January 6th. Sionaidh, Alice, would you like to offer a reflection?
I'll start off. Well, I think there are conflicting thoughts here. On the one hand, I think that our jurisprudence, our case law on speech, does go a bit further than in the US. We don't have that quite tight standard of Brandenburg that the incitement must be likely to cause imminent lawless action. But it doesn't go so much further, but certainly there have been prosecutions and convictions for people, I don't know, burning poppies, that sort of thing. And then you could argue about whether that was skewed by discrimination and racism and everything else. I think a lot of the problem, though, is the power of private providers of the social media, of Twitter, of Facebook. So that is a separate issue from the standard for incitement, where you're looking at when can the government control speech. In the case of the Twitter, you're looking at, well, how much power does a private provider have? I think that certainly ought to be looked at. On the other hand, you don't want a very powerful figure being able to incite insurrection and rebellion all over the place. So it's a bit of a balancing act, isn't it? I mean, how do you somehow manage to control the social media to the extent of preventing too much being disseminated, while at the same time allowing for freedom of speech? I mean, I was quite interested. I mean, I read this here in the US that Angela Merkel had expressed disapprobation of Trump being banned from Twitter, which I found very, very strange, because Germany has some of the strongest hate speech laws and laws that restrain what can be said on Twitter. But I think that this is something we're going to have to take on board. That most of the argument to date has been about the government interfering with one's First Amendment rights, one's freedom of speech. And now you have these hugely powerful private concerns that have as much, even more power, and can be used to great effect by leaders such as Trump. And how do you draw that balance? How do you somehow manage to put constraints on what these private power concerns can do, while at the same time protecting speech? And that is something that I just don't think society has managed yet. But I suspect it's something that a lot of effort's going to have to be put into, if it isn't already, over the next few years.
I mean, it's interesting that in recent weeks and months, Twitter had begun to take measures to try to curtail, to try to limit to some extent the damaging effect, the damaging impact of communications that were coming out of President Trump's Twitter feed. But this did not do the trick. This did not stop him from continuing with the same practice. Alice, do you have something to add on all this?
Yeah, I would completely second all of that, particularly this idea of sort of conflicting thoughts. I mean, as you say, as Twitter sort of started to add little warnings to Donald Trump's tweets after the election, saying that they were spreading misinformation and so on, and eventually, you know, we've seen his Twitter account removed. It felt very much like shutting the barn door after the horse had bolted. You know, this has been going on for a long time, and it's as though the social media companies have sort of suddenly thought, oh, now it's gone too far, now we have to get rid of these things. At the same time, as you mentioned, there is a real question about the extent to which private companies should be able to limit, you know, the ability of an elected official to communicate. Now, of course, President Trump does have plenty of other means of communication at his disposal, aside from Twitter, but nonetheless, it absolutely poses that question. And I think the other thing that I would add here, and this is moving slightly away from the issue of free speech, but something that's been very unique to Donald Trump's presidency has been the way that he has used Twitter to try and conduct the business of government. When we've seen personnel decisions, both in the White House and even in the cabinet, announced via Twitter, when Twitter has sometimes been the best window into what the President of the United States is thinking. And I don't really think we have grappled at all with what that means. I mean, that has legal and constitutional ramifications. It has ramifications for historians in the future who are studying this period. But it is not at all how we expect a government to operate. And at some point, we're going to have to catch up with that issue as well as with the issue of the limits of free speech.
Thank you, Alice. There is a question from Dan Warman, which I think Leslie might wish to pick up. So the question is, was the lack of proportionate reaction by law enforcement and failure of immediate condemnation by the president the single most obvious demonstration of the extent of the disparity in the treatment of white people and people of color, even in the context of the international support the BLM movement received over the spring and summer months? To what extent is that likely to convince anyone still denying institutional inequality?
Well, let's take the president's lack of action first. I think the difficulty with that is the president's lack of action is pretty much how he's been conducting his entire term, particularly in relation to what he thinks about particular groups and in particular and people of colour. So I'm not sure if that's a litmus test telling us anything that we don't already know, that President Trump spouts lots of racist views and opinions. What's more interesting though, and I think I agree with the questioner and the direction of the question, is the way that law enforcement dealt with this. I think yes. The answer is yes. I think the way that the law enforcement dealt with the demonstrators speaks volumes in relation to the differential treatment of sort of like white protesters and let's face it, black protesters. There is a differential treatment that is really difficult to justify in terms of just rational basis, other than saying, this looks entirely racist. I mean to say, in the UK, in 2017, one of our MPs, David Lammy, did a report known as the Lammy Review in relation to the criminal justice system. And at the beginning of his review, it was based on government's own statistics, which clearly showed wide-ranging differential treatments of black people in the criminal justice system at all stages of the criminal justice system, compared with white counterparts, ranging from bail decisions to arrest, etc., etc., etc. And what Lammy said at the beginning of his report in the executive summary, he said this. He said, "Look, where you have such obvious differential treatment, which on the face of it, there doesn't appear to be any rational explanation for it. What you have to do is you have to call it out and say, this is racist. This is based on, either a racist institution or a racist system or racist thought." And I ascribe to that. If you cannot, if there is no rational basis for the differential treatment, I think we should imply that the logical explanation is one of race.
Thank you, Leslie. David, may I ask, is there a discussion right now, and is there scope to hold the police that was responsible for letting the rioters in a way, Capitol, or not effectively policing, to put it in more detail? Is there scope to hold them to account from a disciplinary and even potentially criminal law point of view? And are there any developments in that respect? I think you're still on mute, David. Sorry, we lost you again. Maybe accidentally hit. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, a couple of officers have been suspended in the Capitol Police Force, and departments around the country are investigating whether any of their off-duty officers participated in the assault on the Capitol. I think criminal liability is unlikely, and civil liability is unlikely for departments as well. But for individual officers who participated in the assault, they're going to be criminally prosecuted if we have evidence of their crimes, and they're absolutely subject to internal discipline, and including suspension or firing.
Mm. I mean, it's interesting. In the UK, we have under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights the right, the duty to protect the right to life, which would be triggered in situations, might be triggered in situations like this as a result of the failure of the relevant authorities to protect life. And of course, Leslie, for instance, is an expert on that in relation to Hillsborough, Grenfell, etc. But I'm not sure whether something equivalent applies in
our law differs in that respect.
Thank you, David. I'm aware of the time. I'll try to go through a couple of questions more. Sionaidh, there is one specifically for you, which notes clearly it is more effective in a campaign to break the rules, spread lies and mistruths, and apologize after the event, whilst hoping that the message has already been believed and spread. But how do we engage and diffuse effectively? I think it's Dan Warman again who asks the question. The idea that political parties, take our referendum, for instance, consensuously and willingly engage with such conduct, because they may think that at the end of the day, any consequences, any ramifications will be insignificant vis-a-vis the wider benefit that they're seeking to acquire.
Well, this is why I think accountability and legal accountability is really important, and why I talked about it first, because what I didn't mention was in the context of the Brexit campaign, there was a legal action contesting the legality of the referendum, given that there had been some lies told in the campaign. The Wilson case it was, but because it was a referendum, which is not legally binding, unlike a general election, it could not be successfully challenged under electoral law. So as far as referendums are concerned, Britain hasn't caught up with electoral law generally. Also with the campaign slogans, the battle bus, the lies there. There are all sorts of rules about what you can put on the side of a bus. I mean, buses are covered with advertisements all over the place, but it's the Advertising Standards Agency which regulates those. And again, it doesn't apply to electoral law. So there was no legal accountability in that case. Switching back to the US, that's why I think it's very, very important for there to be effective legal accountability. It's very difficult to move on without it. Because although a lot of people may not believe that lies were told, they may believe that the lies were true, for the other people who see these as lies and see the criminal offences committed, to move on and do nothing is very invidious. So I think accountability is absolutely, it should be there foremost at the very top as really, really important.
Thank you, Sionaidh. I think being conscious of the time here, I will perhaps finish by drawing on the following question and perhaps inviting each one of our panelists to offer a concluding observation if they may. Put simply, one of the participants is asking whether liberal democracy has failed to deal with or prepare for the rise of populism. And here we are today discussing the catastrophic, frightening events of January 6th on Capitol. Sionaidh has reminded us of the disinformation campaign that went on for months on end and led to the very specific results that we are experiencing today. We had the Prime Minister closing down Parliament and the UK Supreme Court finding that this was a significant breach of the rule of law. And if we move further in the European Union, then unfortunately there are many recent instances of incursions, substantial incursions upon the rule of law. We might take an illustration from Poland, where the Supreme Court lost something like 40 or 50% of its composition nearly overnight. And so the populist movement has undertaken attack upon attack upon attack upon liberal democracy. And so here I return to the question asked by Alex of whether liberal democracy is now found to have been unprepared for the rise of populism. And similarly, and to conclude, how do we move on from here to maintain respect towards principles like the rule of law, like human rights, the rights in our constitution, principles that are very central to liberal democracy. I can go around the virtual room here as you appear in my window. Alice, may I start with you?
I was worried you were going to say that, Dimitrios. I think I would have two reflections, I'm afraid neither of which will be very satisfactory. The first of those is, I think it was something that the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai said about a few decades ago about the French Revolution, which is it's too early to tell. And I think we really are in that space at the moment. I don't think it's easy to give an answer for how well liberal democracy is set up to deal with populism. I think we're still going through it. And I think the second reflection I would have, this is particularly in the American context and particularly thinking about Trump, is that there have been all sorts of efforts, understandably, over the last 4 years to try and kind of nail down what is Trumpism. Is it some kind of populism? Is it a very extreme form of conservatism? What exactly is it? And whilst those efforts are understandable, I think they also miss something, which is that when it comes to Donald Trump, I'm not sure there is an ism. It's not clear that there is actually what we would recognize as some kind of coherent set of political beliefs and values. And it's not really clear that there's any kind of intellectual core to what he does and to kind of what his appeal is. So I think drawing on that, I would say that when we're kind of talking about populism, we have to be very conscious of which populists we're talking about in which countries, and particularly when it comes to Donald Trump, be careful about trying to make him or his ideas into something more than they actually are.
Thank you, Alice. Leslie?
My reflection is this. I think when we look at a leader such as Trump, what it illustrates to me is I think there are some characteristics you can take from these populist leaders Firstly, there's the desire to hang on to power at all costs. That there is self-interest and corruption. And I think where you have that, it really pushes our democracy, which is fragile here in the UK and across the Atlantic in the States. I think we have seen just how fragile democracy is. I suppose many would say democracy has won with the election of Biden in November of last year. How it survives, I agree with Alice. We've yet to see. But for my part, it's a good illustration on just how fragile democracy is, and there are real, reminders as to what was happening in the 30s in Europe. When I look at what's happening in Europe today, particularly with the Brexit, and particularly with what's happening with Trump in the States.
Thank you, Leslie. David?
Well, I think we're in for a long global struggle for liberal democracy. Populism is an extreme, worrisome threat to democracy and the rule of law throughout the West. Donald Trump received 47% of the popular vote in last November's election here in the United States. He still has the support of most of the Republican Party. On the other hand, he did lose. He is going to be gone from office tomorrow. A week after he lost his election last November, Moldova's populist president lost his own re-election bid even more decisively to a centrist challenger. The regimes in Poland and Belarus are facing widespread, persistent protests. Salvini's party performed weakly in the latest round of Italian regional elections last fall. In the UK, from my perspective, Boris Johnson has sucked away most of the electoral support for Farage and is now tacking back to the center. The EU seems to be stronger than ever, despite Britain's departure. The EU stood up to the efforts by Poland and Hungary to remove rule of law restrictions on its pandemic relief funds. So I feel like that we're not at the end of the battle, and the results can't be predicted. But I think that there are lots of places to look for hope, and this is just a struggle we're going to be in for quite a while.
Thank you for an optimistic but very clearly well evidence-based view on the future of liberal democracy, David. Thank you very much. Sionaidh?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not so optimistic about liberal democracy. I think there are two distinct courses of action. I think one would be the legal route. And I think that liberal democracy has been a bit taken unawares, was a bit smug about what it achieved. And there are things that one could do with the law. I mean, in the US, it seems to me that you could pass laws to stop so many people being disenfranchised, try and get rid of the filibuster in the Senate. That would make a lot of difference if that happened. In the UK, it's a bit more difficult. I'm not very optimistic about the UK and Boris Johnson, I'm afraid. Everything that seems to be coming along the pathway strikes me as not cause for rejoicing. Attacks on the judiciary, attacks on the Human Rights Act. It may be an outlier, it may not. But the Germans had a word which was a militant democracy, which they used after the Second World War for a democracy that protects itself against populism and fascism and other attacks. So I think there are some things that can be done there. One can try. I think post-Brexit in Britain, it's a lot more difficult once you've left the EU and the Human Rights Convention is under attack. But so many things are not legal in form. you have to somehow stop people believing in conspiracies, QAnon, that sort of thing. How you do that, I don't know, and I'm no expert. I wouldn't hazard to guess, but why do people liken Trump to Jesus? I mean, these sorts of things. Until you can get to the heart of that, you're still going to have a very big problem, no matter how strong your constitution and your law is. And so I'll leave it there.
I'm afraid, Sionaidh, that with COVID, the conspiracy believing cohort has become even stronger. And on that note, I will take the opportunity to thank you all. I'm enormously grateful for your engagement tonight. You're very insightful and thought-provoking, also cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural, I would add, contributions, but also how quickly, how rapidly you have responded to our call to intellectual arms, to respond to the developments, the worrying developments that we have witnessed in the United States in recent weeks, and to draw the parallels that are equally worrying that we are experiencing, that we are observing in this part of the Atlantic, both in the UK, but also other parts of the EU. Despite, David is right, I will agree with him, some positive movements and some positive signs. A big thanks also to our participants for staying with us until this time. In the UK, it's 7:30, and also for spending a good part of their morning if they were observing from the US. I'm also thankful to others who have engaged with us, I know, from other parts of Europe, from France, from Greece, including students and academics that we collaborate with in these countries and beyond. We're looking forward to connecting again soon. And thank you ever so much again for all your invaluable input. Thank you, and see you soon all.